Final Fantasy XIV Dragonflight. Now hear me out. Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and I love MMORPGs. I love Final Fantasy XIV, and I found my love for World of Warcraft again after they started to actually fix that game. And I talk about these games a lot on stream, and we were starting to have a conversation about the state of Dawntrail with Final Fantasy XIV. And it really kind of started to dawn, get it, on a lot of us there that, hey, there's a lot of similarities between Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail and the previous World of Warcraft expansion, Dragonflight. Now, obviously these are different games, and when you get down to the exact minutia, there's going to be a lot of differences. But I think there are some similarities that deserve to be pointed out and discussed because I think the conversation's rather interesting. And it goes to show just how drastically a game can change from one expansion to the other. And with how much negativity and pessimism I have been picking up on in regards to Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail and the current state of the community, I think this is a good discussion to have right now. So let's lay the groundwork. Dawntrail and Dragonflight. What's the foundation for this discussion? And it starts with a really simple concept. They are both the start of a new era for their respective games. When it comes to Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, it is the first real expansion after the Hydaelyn Zodiac arc that concluded with 6.0 Endwalker. It's not the first story that was told in this new era. That honor belongs to the whole Golbez and Zero arc in the patches of Endwalker. However, it's the first new expansion. When people look at the start of this new era, a lot of them will look to Dawntrail. Similarly, when it comes to World of Warcraft Dragonflight, that was coming off the back of one of the most maligned and hated expansions in all of World of Warcraft's history, and that's saying something when it comes to Shadowlands. During that expansion and leading up to that expansion, pretty much every core element to the game was compromised in some way, or was polarizing. Way too many daily and weekly chores to do, paired alongside stubborn game design that just felt anti-fun, while also being obviously flawed to anyone that played the game for more than 5 seconds. Yeah, I'm talking about the Covenant system there. And the story was on a downhill slope for a while, but it came to a head with Shadowlands as, I'll be frank here, they kind of butchered the story that had been culminating in the game, or had been established for decades at that point. It's actually kind of funny because a while back I said that Dawntrail didn't do anything that bad in regards to the actual story, and it didn't ruin anything. And some people were like, yeah, but the story was really boring, or they really didn't like Wook Lamont, or they just viewed it to be a giant waste of time. See, that's not what I consider to be ruining the story. Taking an established narrative from decades ago that is one of the most well-beloved parts and elements of the story, and just shoehorning in this brand new character you came up with, like last Wednesday, and saying it was actually all him the entire time, and doing this with nearly every element of the story, that is just bad writing. That is taking previous established well-beloved stories and just undercutting them and ruining a lot of investment that people had with these stories. As an example, imagine if the story of Dawntrail was this. You see, all those plans that the Archbishop, or that Xenos, or that Yotsuyu, or Fandaniel, and Emmett Selk, all their plans were actually being orchestrated by Wook Lamont the entire time, because she wanted to be the Dawn Servant. Does that sound stupid? Because it is. And that's pretty much, with a little bit of exaggeration, not gonna lie, that's pretty much what happened in World of Warcraft. Attach a cheeky bit of character assassination, and then that's where the state of World of Warcraft going into Dragonflight was. Unfun game design, and philosophy that was intrinsically linked into every core element of the game, alongside an aesthetic that didn't feel congruent with what a lot of people wanted out of World of Warcraft, and out of that game, alongside story decisions that were, at least for a lot of vocal people online, myself included, unpopular, that didn't feel like it fit. It felt clumsy and inelegant. And just changing beloved things for the sake of changing them, and not tackling it in interesting and new ways. Does this sound familiar? Because that was the state of World of Warcraft going into the Dragonflight expansion, and they had a lot of work to do, and to recoup a lot of interest and trust that just had been eroded or eviscerated over the last few years up to that point in time. And Dragonflight was advertised as pretty much the start of a new era for World of Warcraft. There be dragons. Who doesn't like dragons? zones. Like, it's kind of like a meatball down the center of the plate. And they would move a lot of their game design and philosophy away from what had been established for so long for World of Warcraft and go in this new direction. Not forcing you to, like, do all these menial tasks if you want to gear out your character. They were essentially starting fresh here and saying, okay, with this foundation, we will build upon this and iterate upon this going into the future, not just throw the whole thing away and start from fresh with a new expansion. But Dragonflight had one big crippling flaw, and that was the storytelling was still not up to par. Granted, there was some, like, highlights in terms of side quests and just how beautiful a lot of these zones looked, but the tone and the aesthetic were off. Far too cartoony, and that's saying something for World of Warcraft. Too soft. And I know the term Disney like gets thrown around like it's candy, but the tone felt, well, childish. Dragons that had once been depicted as these vicious beings, or at least beings that had some sharpness to them, had their designs largely redone to be more soft, almost friendly. And a lot of the story beats that had happened in Dragonflight just weren't executed with grace, or in my opinion, a lot of competence. They even pretty much did an Avengers on your left scene for like the big climax of the entire story. It was comically bad. But gameplay-wise, the seeds were sown and those were largely accepted. It's just the story still left a lot to be desired. The storytelling and the atmosphere and the tone of the game, that had a lot to, well, prove going into this new World Soul Saga business they were going in on. But while the storytelling of Dragonflight was highly suspect, what it did manage to do, and tell me if this sounds familiar, is lay the groundwork for possible story elements and characters that can be explored and fleshed out in the future. Which, looking back on it, kind of feels like the goal of Dragonflight. Tell this one-off story that just mainly puts the pieces of the puzzle on the game board so they can be utilized further down the line, giving the aspects their powers back, but now from Azeroth, re-establishing Xal'atath as the titular antagonist going into the future, developing this new villain with Iridikron and then putting him on ice so that he can be brought back in the story at some point down the line, likely in The Last Titan. It's laying the groundwork for the story that is to come years and years down the line for this entire new arc of World of Warcraft. And it's doing that through what seems to be this one-off story that is like its own little mini saga. Does this sound familiar? Because, at least at this point, that's the feel that I get out of Dawntrail, where the storytelling is highly suspect to me, and the tone and atmosphere just feel off, but what it's doing is establishing a lot of groundwork to be explored on and expanded in the future. The Azem Cup, developing the entirety of the new world, Alexandria with the Ninth, Kryle's parents, further expanding on the ability to go from one shot to the other and transport various things with it. You establish and you lay all that groundwork out within what feels like it will be a one-off story with Dawntrail that will conclude in 7.3 before we transition into this new era proper. We don't know necessarily if that's how this story will go, but that's at least the vibe I get from it. Now, what are the differences and the similarities here between Dragonflight and Dawntrail? Well, we already talked about how both expansions are kind of representing this new era for the respective games, but I would also argue, at least for giant swaths of Dawntrail, I can even possibly argue the entire thing a little bit, the tone and the aesthetic doesn't necessarily appeal greatly to fans of the older aesthetic. It's a far more lighter tone to differing intensities for the respective game, and the dialogue and the tone of the story going on feels, at least to me, like it's targeting a much younger demographic. But I think the gameplay itself is rather good, especially when it comes to the dungeons and raids in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. And the gameplay loop, and like that element, wasn't perfect in Dragonflight, but at least from the outside looking in, seemed to be far more accepted by people en masse. Dragonflight was also pivoting the direction of World of Warcraft away from that modular expansion to expansion design and shifting it to, we have this core foundation, let's not just throw it away, let's build upon it. They introduced new flying mechanics with dragon riding, and the zones were larger and more expansive to accommodate it, and more vertical. Now, while Dawntrail doesn't have that, you can argue the lane for the flying mounts, not going to be doing that. Dawntrail has the graphical overhaul, and the new zones that are clearly designed to accommodate that graphical overhaul. Now, the difference here is one of the biggest differences between Dragonflight and Dawntrail for their respective games, in my opinion, is what they're coming off the back of. Dragonflight was coming off the back of two of the most widely hated expansions in World of Warcraft history, with Battle for Azeroth, and then immediately after that, you had Shadowlands. So World of Warcraft was coming from arguably the lowest point it had ever been at. Meanwhile, for Dawntrail, it's coming off the back of the Highland Zodiac arc, with Shadowbringers and Endwalker. And I think we started to see a bit of this pessimism roll in with the Endwalker patches and the patch cadence there, but I think Dawntrail overall is coming off a higher high than Dragonflight coming off the back of Shadowlands. But they're both still trying to represent this new era for their own game. They both feel as if they have this lighter tone to them, where the writing in large swaths of it feels kind of immature. Dragonflight in terms of tone and feel, and Dawntrail, in my opinion, in terms of the actual dialogue going on, being very repetitious and lacking a lot of subtlety and nuance that are effective, in my opinion. Dawntrail feeling as if it's largely based on a lot of shonen tropes. Power, friendship, and understanding and all that. I would argue it wasn't all like that. I quite liked the Alexandria portions, but they still had some issues alongside them, largely stemming from that first half Rite of Succession era for Dawntrail. But now, why am I talking about this? Because Dragonflight isn't the latest expansion for World of Warcraft, while Dawntrail is. And when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, and as someone who has been making videos about it since it came out, I have noticed a lot of pessimism and negativity surrounding the game, some of it warranted in my opinion, because I think there are legitimate issues and critiques that should be called out and discussed. However, I have personally never really experienced this level of cynicism when it comes to the state of Final Fantasy XIV before. And I think World of Warcraft Dragonflight showcases one of two directions that Final Fantasy XIV could go in the future. You see, the latest expansion, the one that came out after Dragonflight, is called The War Within. It's like part 1 to this new World Soul Saga trilogy of expansion that World of Warcraft is doing, but funnily enough, the tone, the feel, the aesthetic of World of Warcraft has pivoted drastically from Dragonflight coming into The War Within. It feels far more in line with what I fell in love with World of Warcraft all those years ago. I have played through the story of Dragonflight, at least leveling, and I've played through the story entirely of The War Within so far, and the writing feels drastically better as well, including the storytelling, including the cutscenes. The pacing feels miles better as well, and that gameplay foundation that was established in Dragonflight has evolved with The War Within. While they largely retain that philosophy that they started with Dragonflight, they've bolstered it and honed in on it when it comes to The War Within. They're not perfect in regards to this. There's a large conversation going on in the World of Warcraft community right now in regards to the state of Mythic Plus, which is the repeatable, endgame version of dungeons people run in World of Warcraft. It's not a perfect game, nor is World of Warcraft in the perfect state you could ever imagine it being in. But there's a lot of excitement as a game that what a lot of people, myself pretty much included, once thought was unsalvageable and would just continue down this highway into irrelevance of bad storytelling, bad gameplay design and philosophy, paired alongside an aesthetic that just felt wholly off-putting to me. The game has largely gone another direction, and I think Final Fantasy XIV can do that as well. I think World of Warcraft shows just how drastically something can change going from one expansion to the other, and I don't see why that can't also be applicable to Final Fantasy XIV. Now, the issues plaguing Final Fantasy XIV right now are different from the ones that plague World of Warcraft, but there were some similarities between them that I've pointed out in this video. And I don't think any of these issues in 14 are necessarily unsalvageable, but I think the direction of the game deserves to be looked at and possibly course-corrected. Doing the actual fights in Dawntrail, I really enjoy them. I love the Alliance raid, I love the actual raids that are in there, I love the dungeons, I love the boss design. It's really good. And while I really do like Alexandria for the most part, it's not perfect either. And there's still swaths of the story where it takes a tone and an atmosphere that I I don't find appealing. The Runique section from 7.1 is a good example of what I'm talking about, and the whole Rite of Succession is another great example of what I'm talking about, with the exception of the Mamulja part that happened near the end of it, in 7.0. And I think the two roads that I alluded to earlier for Final Fantasy XIV is either you can have your War Within expansion, which goes back to basics when it comes to the overall aesthetic and tone of the game, building on what you did correct in Dawntrail. In my opinion, that would be fight design, and hopefully the endgame systems when they finally come online later in the patch cycle. You build off of that, the things that work, ideally and hopefully, and you go back to what used to work for the things that no longer work. And I've been talking about recently what I think both of these games need to start focusing in on going into the future. For Final Fantasy XIV, I talked about how they need to be more exciting in the future and not as predictable. And when it comes to World of Warcraft, they need to be more consistent and have better execution and not be as buggy as it has kind of been lately. They need to keep up what they're doing and not have it be a one-off experience. They need this to be consistent. And I think that's another funny little similarity between World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. Their strengths and weaknesses are kind of the opposite to one another. World of Warcraft takes a bunch of risks, throws a whole bunch of new things at the wall and just sees what sticks. You had Mr. Pandaria Remix, you had Plunderstorm, which is coming back funnily enough. They added dragon riding, they're adding drifting to the game as well, adding delves and all that. Now, they need to keep up this consistency to turn this goodwill that's starting to foster and continue delivering experiences of this caliber going into the future while ironing out their optimization and bug issues. When it comes to Final Fantasy XIV, the feeling I get from a lot of people is that the game doesn't take enough risks, isn't nearly as exciting, things are just kind of what you expect it to be. That has some benefits to it, but it's a sliding scale, and you don't want to be on one far end of the extreme. You want to find the right balance between these two elements, between being consistent and predictable and taking risks and being exciting. A lot of the comments I get are that job design is largely boring right now when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV, or it's stale, it's just not exciting. I quite like tanking right now in Final Fantasy XIV, but there's a reason I moved to tanking and away from DPS right now. I just didn't find it particularly fun or exciting or interesting. And when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV right now, a big swath of people I see feel as if the game doesn't have much to do if you're not an endgame hardcore raider. There are things to do in my opinion, but the feeling is that there isn't. And I think that's partially attributed to the fact that a lot of Dawntrail's endgame just isn't in the game right now, and we have to wait like 8 months from the start of the expansion for a lot of these endgame systems to actually start to come online. I get why they do that, but it makes this initial period in the expansion cycle feel awkward, and also kind of deflating. So when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, you can either go the direction of the War Within, which is, as we talked about before, building on what worked in Dawntrail, Dragonflight for them, while having a return to basics when it comes to the tone and atmosphere of the game and the game world and the tone of the story, while arguably also improving on the way you tell a story. I think Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail had a lot of fun solo instances, namely in 7.0. They were really cool. I'd love to see even more of them. Reintroduce some ideas and really take risks like they did with 6.0. Sure, maybe the execution wasn't the best when it comes to certain elements, and maybe some people struggled, but it is a game at the end of the day. And if you abandon an idea or a core concept simply because the execution isn't perfect the first go around, then I think that leads to stale, repetitive design in the future as you're forcibly, forced to rely on the same thing over and over again. At the end of the day, I love both of these games, but I do think they both have their own respective issues, but I think it's really fascinating when you look at these games side by side and you start to glean some of these similarities. Because while they're not one for one, the things that led to certain situations are different between game to game, there are still some things you can kind of glean. How quickly things can change going from one expansion to the other. I mean, heck, look at the tonal difference going from Endwalker to Dawntrail. That's a perfect example right there. Just going in a direction that I don't want it to. But if we look at how cool things like the new Ultimate Fight is, yeah, I want that tone again. I love when Final Fantasy XIV does stuff like that. And like I said before, I am optimistic for this future of Final Fantasy XIV. But optimism doesn't mean that it's a surefire bet. And I think 14 can either continue going down this road and continue doing what it's doing right now with Dawntrail. I would personally not advise that. I don't think that's a healthy, sustainable future for the game. I think that leads to stagnation and repetition. Or they can build off of what worked in Dawntrail, look to their past and see what worked there, reintroduce those elements, while taking it in a new direction and trying to be better. And I think that's the direction Dawntrail and Final Fantasy XIV should go from here. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It'd really help the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.